Welcome back to the show. Today, we're joined by someone who truly embodies entrepreneurial grit, business acumen, and leadership excellence. With over 2 decades of experience leading in the executive recruitment space and as a business owner himself, Hart Hillman brings a unique perspective to the conversation. Get ready for actionable insights and real world wisdom. Let's dive in. You've worn multiple hats: entrepreneur, recruiter, leader. What has each role taught you about building something that lasts?
I perceive wearing multiple hats as sort of a journey. I don't necessarily see them as separate situations, and hopefully have learned a little something from each of them, what to do, what not to do. I think that in the early days, I probably suffered from that wanting to do it all syndrome that a lot of entrepreneurs begin with, and over time, I hope I've learned the skill to delegate and to allow those folks around me to participate and make the mistakes that one naturally makes in taking on new challenges.
I guess I'd start with what made you decide to be an entrepreneur? Were you just always felt that way, or was it something that just bubbled up in your career?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that my career path was, again, as with many people, you sort of back into certain things. Part of it's if you turn left, you go one way, and you turn right, you go another. And luck had a lot to do with it, I think. I was very fortunate in some of the corporate and enterprise jobs that I had early on. And from those, they sort of set the foundation that gave me the courage, the confidence to try and be an entrepreneur and take the learnings and the sort of best practices from the larger organizations and apply them in my own way. And that's really what constituted the foundation for Bigwin Group.
I see that in a lot of people that are starting out and they want to become entrepreneurs and they want to short circuit the process in terms of just jump right in. How much would you value your time in the corporate world before you really got out on your own?
I mean, I was pretty fortunate. I worked at Apple when it was originally called Apple Computer back in the early days. That was a great learning for me, and it allowed me to be entrepreneurial within the organization. Apple in Canada had 36 people working there, and this was pre Macintosh. At the time, we introduced a 64K computer, the Apple IIe. I mean, 64K today, you probably have more memory in your toothbrush than that. But Apple as a learning ground, they encourage taking on responsibility, taking on authority, making decisions, and owning them. And it was a very flat organization, particularly in Canada, but even worldwide. And it was a great learning ground. They combined encouraging taking risks and trying new things with great backup support in terms of learning. And I was there for almost 13 years.
Was there anyone that you would look back on as a mentor at Apple or anywhere that really started you off and made such a difference in your life?
Yeah, I go back to a lot of things that happen in your life are just really good fortune. And I had the chance to work with some really great leaders and ultimately both mentors and friends. Originally, the Apple president in Canada, his name was Peter Jones, was a tremendous leader in the classic player coach vein. And he was inspirational, and yet he could be tough when he had to be. So he was the kind of leader that you would aspire to be yourself. And I was very fortunate. I worked at Compaq briefly under Ron Hulse, and Ron was also what was to become a very good friend in my life, and also again a great leader who set the example of working really hard himself. You never got the feeling that he was asking you to do something that he wouldn't do himself. So again, I think fortune plays a role. I mean, opportunity, what's that expression? Opportunity knocks, but you have to get off the couch and go answer the door. I think there were a lot of mentors. There were a lot of people that I looked up to over the years. And by the same token, I would tell you that there were leaders that I learned what not to do, where they, didn't empower people or they diminished people. And you get as much learning from those leaders as you do from the ones that you aspire to become.
Yes, it's funny that way. You learn what not to do. Whenever I've had a crisis in my life, it's always been, why did I have to go through that? But looking back, it's like the valuable lessons from all that. You've been running a business and at growing it and at the same time guiding others in their careers. It gives you a really rare vantage point from all of that. How would you define success in leadership today in 2025?
Do you mean for individuals in general, or
How do you groom leaders, future leaders today, given all the changes, technology, we've got AI coming on. How do you make what makes a great leader today? How do you help develop them? Because you're doing both. You're running this business and at the same time you're really guiding others. And of course, the impact you have being an executive search, you're meeting with very strong, impressive candidates, and you're helping guiding them in their own careers too. What are the learnings you get from that?
when I think about leadership and obviously we're in the business of leadership, as you say, we work with both organizations that are trying to fill their leadership ranks, and we work with the candidates, the sources and prospects that can fill those positions. What tends to stand out in terms of great leaders are probably two or three things that really consistently come up again and again. I think the first that we've seen that is consistent is a real hunger for information and knowledge. The lifelong learner is a leader that, regardless of their type, in other words, they can be introverts, they can be extroverts, they can be highly verbal and people oriented, or they can be highly analytical and reserved. This real hunger for gaining information, for not believing that you have all the answers, and that surrounding yourself with people that are obviously in many cases smarter than you are. There's an old expression: if you're the smartest voice or the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. That's really important. I think the second thing that strikes us in leadership harkens back to Charles Darwin and his commentary around the race doesn't go to the smartest or the fastest, but rather the most adaptable. And adaptability, I think, is still a key success factor or determinant of success. You mentioned AI, and AI is, of course, not only in vogue, but it's not a trend. It's absolutely having a huge impact on the way people do things. But AI should not ever replace, I don't think AI will replace the human judgment aspect. I mean, can it do things faster, more efficiently? Absolutely. But the ability to humanize the results of what AI does, at least at this point in time, is still very viable. So we're again going back to the notion of taking the tools and some of the output that AI gives and putting a human element to it. And I still think that's very real and very possible to do.
Yeah, no, that's great feedback. And you've got me thinking what you specialize in is really in executive search is finding the right person for the right role. And it can really change the company. So you've got a lot of responsibility with your clients in terms of making sure you've got the right person in the right role, because it can change the whole future of the company. There's so much on the line. What's a common mistake that businesses make when they're building a leadership team?
I think you're leaning into a very important point, and that is that building a leadership team is it's a push-pull. It's a combination of obviously finding the right individual, but at Bigwin Group, we like to talk about ensuring that you don't find the wrong individual, that you don't get a mishire. And for any executive leader who is hired, and that probably covers a broad swath, the cost of a mishire to an organization cannot be underestimated. It's painful. If you subscribe to Brad Smart's book, Top Grading, which is an interesting book on leadership, and he talks about the cost of a mishire being anywhere from 15 to 25 times first year's compensation for a new hire. And that's a material number. When you start talking about a senior executive, a VP level and up, you can be talking three, four, $500,000 and more. And if you multiply that by the cost of a mishire, that's a big number. So I think one of the learnings and one of the things we've seen is that it's important to really define before you go to market what good looks like. We in particular tend to be very labor intensive upfront. We spend a lot of time with our clients using a number of assessment and psychometric tools to combine sort of the art and science of good executive search. And the goal is to ensure that although there's almost always a sense of urgency, there's always a sense of we've got to get it done today, we've got to fill that seat as quickly as possible, there is a rational cadence that you want to follow to make sure that you get the right hire. And that's probably one of the things that we try to impress upon our clients, that better to take an extra few weeks or even a month or longer to get the right hire than to rush to judgment, get the wrong hire, and then have to replace that individual. The opportunity cost to an organization, the morale cost to an organization is really very, very significant.
So you're reminding me of that old phrase, penny wise or pound foolish. I guess it's almost that's a very old phrase, but I guess it's in terms of just time and energy, let alone the negative impact if you rush to decision is what you're really getting at here. And it really resonates. A lot of times I personally see clients measuring on time to fill role in how long it takes, as opposed to being, is it the right person, instead of just having filling a seat for the sake of filling a seat. What's one leadership principle you believed but have since outgrown over time? Something you might have started off in your career with that you really believed was the way to go, and what's one that you find today you've outgrown and then you've had to let go and move on from? Some leadership trait.
Outgrown, that's an interesting way to describe it. I think that over time there's a natural humility that leaders face. I think that as leaders have humbling experiences in their career, and most leaders that we work with have stumbled a couple of times. They've skinned their knees, they've made mistakes, and what we've seen is that those leaders who have only gone from success to success actually are not necessarily as equipped as those who have skinned their knees. And I think that, one of the things that's taught me, and I've certainly had my share of humbling experiences, I think what I've learned from that is that first of all, it's okay to make mistakes. Obviously, you don't want to repeat them if you can avoid it. Secondly, you can move forward at a cadence that is rational, that allows you to achieve without rushing headlong into a brick wall. So it's what I'm defining as patience. Patience with a sense of urgency. And I know those sound almost contraindicated, but they're not. And I think that with experience and maturity comes that sense of, okay, if it isn't done today, can it be done tomorrow? And if it is done tomorrow, can it be done better than it would have been done today? I suspect that may be somewhat cliche or trite. I hope it's not, but that's certainly been our experience, that better to focus on a limited number of things you want to achieve and do them really, really well, and take the time to do them well, because they ultimately hold you in better stead and set you up for success.
Less is more, in a sense.
Less is more.
Really focus, yes.
I would say, yes.
You've kind of answered where I was going to go next. I'm just like thinking about if you look back in your career, what's one leadership decision you've made in your own business that taught you the most about leading with integrity and with clarity?
One of the harder decisions that young leaders or any leader faces is when an individual is not working out. And I think there's always that dilemma of you care for your people, you are, often we call our team, part of a family, and that ethos around caring deeply about people prevents you from taking hard decisions and making hard decisions. And I'm thinking of situations where an individual was struggling in a role or a position, but the emotional connection to the individual prevented you from taking action sooner. And there was always the optimism and the hope that they would improve or find their path or start delivering. So, well, it's not our, it's never easy to remove somebody from a position that they're in. Sometimes it's harmful to the rest of the team or the rest of the organization to leave them in that position. And ironically, it's also very often painful or not a good decision for the individual who's not performing as well. You're not really doing them a favor by keeping them in a position where they're floundering or struggling. And I think that's certainly something that I've learned over time. And it's not really to fire quickly and hire slowly, because that's sort of trite and sort of a cliche. But I think the reality is when there are issues, deal with them. Don't try and sweep them under the rug. Don't just hope that they're going to go away on their own.
That's really tough to do, but at the same time, it always turns out to be the best way to do it is deal with it right up front.
Well,
That
for everybody. And
yeah, yeah.
that's the challenge. You, on one hand, you're thinking of, well, how does this affect this individual? And you should think that way. But if they're not being successful, they're probably aware that they're not being successful. That's not going to come as a surprise. And you're not doing them any favors, even in the short term, certainly not in the long term.
They think they are doing them a favor by trying to just keep helping them in doing in something that they themselves just are turned off by or whatever it is. I think you've really nailed that. You just aren't doing them any favors. It makes so much sense. If someone listening today was to elevate their leadership style today, a young person just entering into leadership for the first time, what's one intentional practice that you would recommend they start right now to get off on the right foot as they start their leadership journey?
Again, I've been really fortunate in my career and in my life. I've been associated with and actively reached out to leaders that I wanted to be mentored by. I think a young leader today can absolutely benefit from developing relationships with people that they look up to, leaders that have already demonstrated the kinds of traits and successes that they want to emulate. I'm a huge believer in picking up the phone or getting on an email or contacting just about anybody. I would put that wide open and call them up. And I mean, obviously, if you have a warm introduction, that's easier. But I think that a sincere outreach to many leaders actually results in them being open to a discussion or conversation. And look, some of the great leaders in the world are extremely busy. Get it. But I think they're also honored by and willing to have a discussion with young up and coming leaders who see them as a mentor, and the ability to get above the noise, the ability to break through with those leaders and give them a compelling reason why they should invest a little bit of time with you or even a lot of time with you is going to be contingent upon you coming up with something that's a little bit different. In other words, we have a concept that I've learned over the years. It's called getting inside somebody's 99. And what that means is that 99% of the time, people are very involved with their own world. 99% of the time, they're focused on what their needs are in their business, with their family, everything having to do with their own perspective. And I think that a young aspiring leader who wants to get into a mentorship relationship with some great leader, they have to understand that it's not about the need of that young person as much as it's getting inside the 99. What's important to that leader? So have you read a white paper by that leader? Have you listened to some podcasts where that leader's been featured? Can you identify as you reach out and say, listen, I was listening to what you said on whatever subject it happens to be, and I was absolutely blown away and excited and captivated by what you said. And I had a couple of questions for you around that. I think it's important how you approach those people, but I've heard some really terrific stories over the years of young up and comers who had the chutzpah, the courage to approach people that were unapproachable, the Steve Jobs of the world, the great leaders of the world. And through authenticity and sincerity, they were allowed to come into that world. And they were shocked by the fact that those individuals would call them back or would give them the benefit of a interview or a discussion or even a mentorship relationship. So I would say be unabashed, be brave, be bold, and have fun with it. And in so doing, all those people that you reach out to will also feel that kind of energy and will be open to it. I know I would be.
Some very powerful and inspiring words there. And you brought it full circle from where we started, because you were talking about, in today's world, you've got to be adaptable, which means don't rely on the way you've always done, and be committed to lifelong learning. And you're saying learn from others and reach out, and who are the best and who do you want to emulate. And some great points as we continue to grow and go down the journey of leadership excellence. I really appreciate this conversation, and I look forward to more. So thanks again, Hart. This is
It was
terrific.
fun. It was fun. Thanks a lot.